Ready? Okay, should we get started? Maybe? Someone say maybe? How about now? Should we get started now? Bismillah, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we've been looking at the incident of Al-Isra wal Mi'raj, and last week we looked at some of the parts where the Prophet ﷺ was presented by the angel Jibreel in a moment of thirst, a vessel filled with wine and a vessel filled with milk. People remember we talked about this. We talked about the nature of the fitra, and ended at a place where a ladder was brought out and the Prophet ﷺ was announced as having permission to enter into the heavens with the angel Jibreel. So we want to read through some of this as we're going through this portion of the Seerah, and just to kind of place it for people who might not have been with us for a little bit of time. We're now essentially entering into the end parts of the Meccan period of the prophetic biography. The Prophet has had more than a decade now of persecution, tribulation, a lot of difficulty. They've sustained boycotts. They've gone through a variety of abusive situations. They've seen companions be forced to migrate. They've been killed, murdered, a lot of difficulties. The Prophet also sustains the loss of his uncle Abu Talib, his wife Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. He goes to the city of Taif, and rather than being embraced, he, after he's cut off ties with the city of Mecca, is now abused and also turned out of the city of Taif. And we've been looking at this narrations around Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj in a prism of healing, right? فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا. The Quran says that with difficulty there comes ease, with difficulty there comes ease. And many would explain this journey as being the source of ease in the aftermath of the difficulties that the Prophet sustained. We talked about it through a prism of knowledge acquisition. The Prophet is 52 years of age at this time, right? And you don't want to lose sight of that because it's pretty remarkable. I don't know how many of you, like, I don't think anyone in this room is above 50, right? And I don't know if any of you are older than me. I'm 42. You don't have to say if you're older than me, but I'm 42 years old. I don't know if I come across as like a bitter, angry old man. Do I? Is that why you're laughing so hard? Yeah? No? That's crazy. Yeah. So, but think about most elder people that you know, right? They're not necessarily kind of hallmarked as being people of patience or people of compassion. The Prophet is in his 50s, has gone through all this difficulty, and is still a source of compassion and a source of mercy, right? It's remarkable, subhanAllah. But here he's still learning through the angel Jibreel. Right? And we talked about how knowledge acquisition is also a source of healing and a source of contentment. May Allah make us people of sound knowledge and wisdom to implement that knowledge in our lives. And so we've been talking about it in these frames. I wanted to go back because a couple of people were asking me questions around the idea of the Prophet being presented both wine and milk, and then making a decision in relation to these two items that he could have chosen either one, and the idea that had he not chosen the milk, had he chosen the wine, the angel Jibreel had said that your community would have strayed away, right? Do people remember, right? So they say the Prophet then felt the greatest thirst that he had ever felt, whereupon Jibreel brought him a vessel of wine and a vessel of milk. He chose the latter. Jibreel said, you have chosen fitra, natural disposition. And if you had drunken the wine, your community would have strayed from the right way, and none but a few of them would have followed you. Right? Do people remember we talked about this last week, right? Understanding from the standpoint of like the legality of it, if we were to give a hukam on the drinking of either of these two things, they're both permissible for the Prophet to drink either one. Does that make sense? Like they're both allowed, hence they were presented to him, right? Wine is prohibited for us to drink. The prohibitions around alcohol are not coming in the Meccan period of Islam. But had they even been set forth at this time, the angel is presenting to him an option to take either one. Does that make sense so far? So, just from the standpoint of the legality of it, the legality meaning the way you have things that are permissible and impermissible, right? Like if we have at the bookends of the spectrum, what is fard or obligatory and what is haram or strictly prohibited. In the middle, we have what is mubah or neutral. And then in between, we have what is mustahab or recommended. And we have what's makruh or disliked, right? These are kind of the 5 elemental categories of the ahkam that exist for the most part. In the Hanafi school, they separate makruh into makruh tahrimi, so disliked closer to haram, and makruh tanzihi, like disliked at a lesser degree. And they interject a category between fard and mustahab, or obligatory and recommended, that is wajib or necessary. We could talk about why if people want to, but just understanding like they have 7 categories, most people have 5. And everything that is to the left of haram is permissible for argument's sake, right? So these two choices are both permissible. But one, had that choice been chosen, regardless of its permissibility, would have had negative consequence. Do you understand? The other is permissible also, but its chosen nature then yields like positive, or at least it yields the absence of detriment, right? Like the angel Jibrail is saying, had you chosen the former, you drank the wine, your community would have gone astray. He doesn't say because you chose the milk, they're going to be all good. But the absence of detriment is still in and of itself beneficial. Does that make sense? But why we want to think about this a little bit more is because both choices were permissible. The permissibility of it in and of itself is not enough to then say that both would have been good choices to make. Regardless of the permissibility, both being permissible, one still would have yielded negative consequences. And this is an important thing to understand because anything has the opportunity of being hyper focused to a point of detriment. And for a lot of us, religion, when it's given to us, is given with a hyper legalized focus to it without really understanding the bases of how these things function. So you do learn words like fard and haram before you're taught how to celebrate the divine in your life, which I don't think is a good thing. You got to have iman before you have practice, or at least some combination thereof, right? You're taught to pray your sunnah prayers before you're taught whose sunnah you follow. And some of you, like we went to Medina together, either this year or in previous years, you experience like the actual barakah of the Prophet ﷺ. You can't deny it once you experience some of those things, right? It's tranquil, it's serene. That's just what it is. But in understanding why this is an important thing, sometimes it's not enough that something is allowed for that to make it a good decision. Do you understand? And the recognition of the consequences, even where it's permissible, becomes important to understand because a permissible choice would have yielded negative consequences here. Does that make sense? And permissibility devoid of ethics doesn't necessarily find its place within our tradition. Do you know? So it's not a problem to have a laptop or to make a laptop. Some of you in this room actually have the skills to create a computer, mashallah. I don't know how to do that. Do you know? That's crazy that you could make this thing, subhanallah. Do you know? But an understanding that the production of it in and of itself is not negated in its permissibility because somebody could use it for something haram. Do you know? Right? It's okay to make it. That logic, though, doesn't apply to every single industry. Do you know? Because if I manufacture weapons, the likelihood of that being something that is used to kill or murder somebody is very high, right? And when you are investing in stocks that include also the investment in weapons manufacturing companies, somebody might say to you, well, the creation of an object in and of itself is not the problem because how somebody uses it, that's on them. But do you really want to make money off of a product that fuels genocide and occupation? Do you know? Do you get what I mean? There's a man by the name of Sunan Qudus. Sunan Qudus is the leader of a group called the Wali Sango. The Wali Sango are a spiritually inclined group of Muslims who they essentially bring Islam to Far East Asia. The prevailing religion at the time of their entrance into that part of the world was one that engaged in polytheistic theology, including demographics that had a deep deference and reverence to a point of deifying animals, especially cows. Sunan Qudus, when they got on the ground, told the Wali Sango and his followers, we're not going to eat beef anymore. He didn't say it was haram to eat beef, but he said, out of a recognition of the practice and belief of our neighbors who have this deference towards these animals, we're just not going to eat beef. And not only did they not eat beef, they very purposely took care and groomed their livestock that much more. Everybody's pretty much Muslim in Indonesia and Malaysia and that part of the world, right? It's not, it's just a fact, do you know? But there's a sense that permissibility in and of itself was not the sole variable of arguing engagement of a decision. There was a sense of how consequently will there be impact through the choice that I undertake. Do you see? And so here, both options are permissible. The wine and the milk are permissible. But the permissibility is not sufficient alone to just make a decision. There's still a need to think out the consequences to the decision, even though it has permissibility to it, and there's going to be ethics involved. Does that make sense? And a lot of the times, decisions that we make are going to be rooted in this prism. This is an example that I like to use. Can I have your cups? Can you bring me that bottle and that cup? Sorry, I'm a bitter old man, remember? So I need to have you bring it to me. A lot of times, the way we see things are through quantifiable metrics, right? Let's pretend these both had the same beverage in it, right? Water and whatever, Thai milk tea, right? So let's pretend both of them are water, okay? This has more than this, correct? So arguably, this is better. If I was to ask you which one you would take, you take the one that has more. It's quantifiably better than the one that has less, correct? That's how a lot of us understand and assess decisions, through quantifiable metrics. Do you see what I mean? If you think about this now at a prism of ethics, right? A lot of you are not older than me. We established that. So some of you are trying to figure out, what do I want to do with my life? What am I going to do as a career? And say you had now an opportunity to have like a stable career. You're going to be an accountant and they're going to pay you $100,000 a year, right? But then you also have the option of following your passion. You're going to become an artist and you want to be an artist. Do you know? And both options are on the table and you don't know how to choose. You're oscillating between both, back and forth, back and forth. And then the guy who offered you this job said, I'm going to give you $30,000 more to do this. So it goes from 100 to 130,000. And if these two things were equal in the beginning, artistry or accounting, and I didn't know what to choose, then the inclusion of an added benefit to this one should make it theoretically better, right? Because if this is half full and this is a quarter full, and I filled this to the top, then adding more to it would make it the better choice, right? But I still don't know how to decide. The 130K still has me in this place of, do I become an artist or an accountant? Because it's not a quantifiable assessment, it's a qualitative assessment. And you're trying to make a decision through measurable metrics, like the way I hold this in my hand, when in reality, the measurement that you have is not tangible or external, it's internal, it's at the level of values. And this is what the Prophet is doing in this instance. Both the wine and the milk are permissible, but the permissibility is not in and of itself what is the necessary variable to choose. He could have drank both of them. Well, Jibrail, I'm really thirsty. I want to drink the milk and the wine, right? But why does he choose the milk is an important part of this thing called Islam. Because you exist in a world of existence right now, in a series of existences that is qualified as being a world of choices and decision making, a world of actions. And if you're going to only measure through how much of this versus how much of this and see it only in quantifiable metrics, then that's what you're going to measure it through. But then when you get to places where the measurement cannot be deduced through something quantifiable and it's qualitative, it's going to require you to have a sense of ethics and values that informs you knowing why you're doing what you're doing and thinking about it not just in the immediate, but in the long term. Choices and decisions are not going to create paralysis anymore, but they will be things that you take more time to assess and then determine with an air of a confidence that makes accountability that much easier. That, well, this is why I'm choosing to do this thing. Do you see? And the allowance of it is not necessarily enough, right? The giving of a salam from the standpoint of the hukam is a sunnah, it's not fard, right? All of you did not say salams to every one of you when you came in the room, did you? No, right? It's not haram that you didn't do that. The reply to the salam categorically is a obligation that has a communal aspect to it. Somebody gives salams, somebody better respond to that salam. Do you know? It's one of the few times the doing of a sunnah has a greater ajr than the doing of a fard. Do you see what I mean? You're not obligated to give salams, but is that enough of a reason to not do it? Do you understand? And you're not doing something haram if you don't give salams. But what if everybody greeted everyone that they knew, and then there was someone in the room that knows nobody? Whose responsibility is it to acknowledge that person's existence? And that's why you cannot have just a hyper legalized understanding of religion that says it's not an obligation. If anything, why the recommended acts become the means to increase love is because when you don't have to do it, you just want to do it. That's why you do it. Do you know? But if we were to just say theoretically, wouldn't it be better for people to greet people than not greet people? And would it make sense for me to say, well, it's not fard for me to greet people, it's only recommended, so I'm just not going to do it? The ethics become important in the scenario. Do you understand? You cannot have complete Islam. You can have some aspect of Islam. You cannot have complete Islam if it gets divorced from the ethical component to it. When the Prophet describes alayhi salam in different hadith as to why he was sent, right? One of the hadith, not the only one, that says, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِيُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ, that I was sent to perfect ethical conduct, good behavior. That's like a big part of the religion. You live in a weird time, because in modernity, there's a lot of growth and a lot of gain, but also in modernity, like institutions have values. They shift from individuals being virtue-driven and value-driven to companies having ethics, right? How can a company have ethics? Like, really think about it. That's the equivalent of me saying this building has ethics to it. How can a building have an ethic to it, right? People have ethics. Buildings cannot have ethics. Entities cannot have ethics. You might claim that there's corporate values and whatever else, and that's fine, right? But it's a shift because historically, people were taught to be governed by values and ethics. After you leave kindergarten, there's no more golden rules that are being taught, right? Don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. Say please, say thank you, express apologies. Do you know what I mean? It stops at some level in your curricular engagement, doesn't it? And why? And then if decisions are not being made through a prism of ethics, what are they being made through? Because they're still being made, right? And so this point is important for us to go back, and some people were asking me stuff about it. That's why we're going back. Both of these things are permissible. The wine and the milk are permissible. But even though they're permissible, engaging in one that is still permissible for the Prophet at that time, right? And don't like splice this up where I'm like cut up online saying wine is permissible. Wine is permissible. It is not. Like, it's haram. Do you know? So on Al-Isra and Wal-Mi'raj, when the Prophet is presented with these, both are permissible, but one that's permissible still yields consequently something problematic and negative, correct? There's got to be something else that goes into it. So I like for us to do, just because we're starting to get talking, do you know? You want to think. Islam is a thinking person's religion. Do you see? You can't be scared to utilize what makes you unique as a human. Your cognitive capacities were gifted to you for a reason. If I'm not making decisions on ethics, what else can I make them on? It's an important thing to understand, because most of what we choose is not unconscious, right? Like, I can breathe right now and not have to think about it. Alhamdulillah, that's not a blessing that everybody has. May Allah make it easy for people. Do you know? I can blink my eyes and I don't have to think about it. Do you know what I mean? But there's going to be certain things that come into play, right? Like, if I don't give these things back, do you know? If I just drink them up right now, do you know what I mean? None of you are going to say anything to me, right? What's going to govern that decision? Do you know what I'm saying? Right? I'm not going to drink your stuff. I'm going to give it back to you. But do you get what I'm saying? And every single day, whether it's on default settings or not, something is informing choices and decisions. If it's not ethics, what is it? What is contributing to the choices that I'm choosing? And you have to understand what those things could be in order to then recognize, is that worth what my decision should be founded upon? Does the question make sense? If you can turn the person next to you, if you don't know names, exchange some names. If you've never been here before, you don't want to talk only if you think you're saying the most correct thing, nor do you want to be silent because you're worried you're going to say the wrong thing. We want to learn from each other. You want to get to a place where you can express your ideas on things so that it helps make more concrete what it is that we're discussing and talking about, right? So here, there could be a multitude of things, but let's just to get talking a little bit. If we're not making decisions on ethics, what are we actually making decisions on when choices are presented to us? Does the question make sense? So let's talk it out for a couple minutes and then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, okay, thank you. Okay. So what are some of the things we're discussing? Like what are some of the things that I'm possibly making my decisions off of if they're not through the exertion of ethics and values? What are other possible kind of scenarios? What do we talk about? Yeah.
We talked about how, well, one, talking about the speed in which you make decisions, that makes it that kind of clouds judgment.
The speed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Everything's very snappy, very quick, especially here in New York. So I think that when you're operating on that speed, it's very subconscious. Like you're not really thinking things through. Sometimes you're just acting on whatever you see in front of you. So sometimes you're not making the right decision, and you're just basing on maybe recency bias or whatever it is. I think that will impact what you do.
Okay. Yeah.
Going off like they said the span, I said to my group, people make decisions based off their wins. So like, maybe like one day you're like feeling like very smart or like you're level headed, and then the next day you're like very emotional, something traumatic happened to you. So it's like, when you make like as you go day by day, like you're in a different state when you make a decision, and that's why like a lot of people when you see people making a stupid decision and it was obvious that they could have made a better one, at that moment when like for them it was like going back to what you said, like that snappiness, like in that moment, instantaneous, however you were feeling, whatever you had at that moment, you just made a decision and you went with it.
Good, right? So if we were to start to name things, right? Exhaustion can make decisions. Do you know? Like hastiness can be attached to like arrogance. It can be attached to anxiety. It can be the outcome of different things, but emotions can make decisions. Do you see what I mean? Right? These are particular things. Can ethics overlap with this? Yes, but they can also be independent of it, right? What else could be making decisions? Yeah.
We allow our nafs to tell us, okay, this is gonna suit something you really need or a goal you have. This might be the way, and it could actually just be the nafs trying to satisfy something lower than our highest good.
Yeah. So if we were to think about the seat of ethics, right? Like when our traditions talk to us about things like courage and integrity and beauty and faith, right? Quite often, these are things that are seated and rooted in the heart, right? May Allah give us sound, soft hearts, right? And then there's other parts of us that exist in, at times, antagonistic relationships to the heart or seek to overpower and overwhelm the heart, do you know? So something can be kind of influenced by the ego, the lower self. Do you know? What else? Yeah.
I think argue that sometimes you make decisions based on not based on ethics, but because it's like you want an offer. or like you're ordered to do so. For example, when Allah says something, you might not have the intelligence to kind of extract wisdom or ethical like, extrapolation from it, but like I'm gonna do it because Allah wants me to.
But that's an ethic. Like if you're doing what Allah is telling you to do, you're doing that, and that's an ethic that informs your decision. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Right? What's the opposite of an ethic or a value?
Doing what other people, how can I say, what other people will think about you, like acting according to.
Yeah, good. So we can make decisions based off of what other people think about us. And that could be through a source of strength, but quite often it could be from insecurity, right? Do you know? And the idea isn't to be self-deprecating. Like things can be hard. We're built into societies that benefit from us being exhausted all the time and not having good self-care. Do you know? But from a language standpoint, you know, like sitting is different from standing, right? Uh, a lie is different from like a truth. Do you see? Right? Cold is the opposite of hot. What is like the opposite of being ethical? And don't say unethical, right? But like, what is the opposite of an ethic or a value? It's antonym.
Being corrupt.
Yeah, being corrupt, fine, right? But yeah, huh? Dishonest, right? So if you have like a virtue, then you can have a vice. Do you know? Right? If we talk about like kind of purifications of the heart, we have ailments of the heart. Do you see what I mean? And the category in egocentric societies usually have us favor decision makings off of vices, not virtues. You know, people go up a corporate ladder. Statistically, they're ones who have lesser emotional intelligence. Like middle management statistically has more emotional intelligence than CEOs, because advancement in many kind of sectors is not rooted in the exertion of ethics, but the compromise of ethics. Do you know? You can become the president of the United States. You just have to be comfortable killing a lot of babies. And that's not meant to be anything other than a reality. Do you know? That's what it is. You could be the CEO of a company. People can make like billions of dollars. It's just fundamentally not possible to make that much money without at some point in the pipeline there being some mode of exploitation. Did you see? And so understanding that, hey, I'm actually built to also make decisions through things like greed. I can make decisions through selfishness. I can tell myself I'm not, but I can do that though, right? I can make a decision that says my stomach has to be full always, regardless of how many people's stomachs have to be empty. Do you know? I could be in a place where the decision making rooted through egocentric societies or whatever that socializes me to get to that place. But if I can make a decision through ethics, I can also make decisions through the opposite of ethics. And then that can lead towards corruption. It can lead towards dishonesty. It can lead towards these things. And that's why we study these things. It's not so we just have Sunday school trivia knowledge. It's not so that I can give a halakha or give a dars. It's so that it influences how I live my life. And the capacity is there for people to be dishonest. May Allah protect us from being like that. Greed, selfishness, avarice, these are all things that fuel societies, right? Lust, desire, whims. What is it other than like love of money? You know, ours isn't a religion that's anti-money. It's anti the love of money. The love of money like puts people in places where they do all kinds of gross things to other people. Do you know? Just like you can make decisions through your heart, you can make decisions through your stomach, you can make decisions through your sexual organs. You can make decisions in pursuit of contentment. You can make decisions in pursuit of complacency. The Prophet is exerting foresight. This is why you don't want to learn things in isolation of each other. But his training as a shepherd that we talked about more than a year ago, unique in relation to the sheep has limited visibility. It does not have foresight. It relies on the shepherd to see at a distance, right? So why would he do anything other than drink the milk? This is how he's built. This is what he's trained to do. What were you trained to make decisions on? And if at kindergarten you stopped learning how to treat other people well, like why wouldn't you make the decisions you make in the ways that you make them? Do you know? Every time I do something right for somebody, I feel like I deserve a cookie or something. You know? No, just go do good things, right? Let Allah give you what you deserve at the end of it. Don't determine that you deserve something in relation. You're supposed to do what's right because it's the right thing to do, not because it's transactional and I need somebody to give me a medal every time I do something that's great. Do you know? And then it makes it a lot easier to understand concepts like intention. Because if I can understand what informs decisions, I can get to a place where I'm honest and say, I'm just trying to feed my greed at this point. I am making decisions through my ego, through my nafs. This is why the part that talks about community going astray is important, because embedded in the decision is a sense of, hey, it's bigger than just me. There's other people who get impacted when I'm not living to my best version of myself. And so it might be easier for me to just sit and do nothing and exert decisions through greed, or even use this type of framing, right? We don't have it as much in our community, but I travel a lot. I don't know how much you all travel, right? But I go to a lot of other communities. I speak to people, conferences, small groups, large groups. The gross majority of people that I sit with, they'll first preface their discussions with, is this allowed? Is this permissible? Because they can only think in fiqh-based terms. And that's one dimension of multiple dimensions in our tradition. And they're trying to reconcile in dissonance unethical behavior towards them through the framing of fiqh. Is it allowed for my husband to do this? What she's really trying to say is, why is my husband such a jerk? I still remember when I spoke at a university in Texas many years ago, and I had talked about domestic violence and abuse, and there was like this many people afterwards mingling and eating like cookies, refreshments. There was a girl that was probably like this far away while I was talking to people here. And from there, she's talking to me, and she said, not like in an abrasive way, but just like as if a veil was being lifted. Are you telling me it's wrong for my father to hit me? It's hard to think only in fiqh terms, and then dissonance in the prism of fiqh terms only makes it harder to then deal with the absence of ethics towards us when we don't know why people do the things that they do, and we're trying to figure out, like, it must somehow be allowed in some skewed like way. Do you see? And you got to be different. You don't want to anomalize things that our tradition is laden with, right? Allah is kind and he loves kindness and he gives for gentleness what he does not give for harshness. The merciful one is merciful to those who are merciful. Be merciful on the earth. The one who is in the heavens will be merciful to you. Allah is beautiful and he loves that which is beautiful. We can go on and on and on about beautiful hadith that talk to us about values and ethics that are the majority and the norm. And then they inform decision making. and choices. And that's why this part of this narration is so critical, because your prophet chose the milk. He didn't instinctively or unconsciously. It wasn't like, I didn't know what was in it and I was just thirsty, or I like milk better, or this and that. He chose it, like, consciously. Do you see? And you want to start to exert conscious mode of decision making that starts to then influence how you see choices, and not to be intimidated or scared, but you just try your best. And if you made a choice that could have been done better, you go back, you make istighfar, you believe in a God that's the most merciful of those who show mercy and is looking for a reason to forgive you, but you actually want that forgiveness and you're remorseful, and then you still continue with a sense of accountability that says, we weren't supposed to be perfect to begin with. Do you see? And it starts from understanding that it wasn't that he was given a haram choice and a halal choice. Both were jaiz, both were permissible. But even where it was permissible, one still would have yielded negative consequences. Does it make sense? The last thing I'm going to say on this is not going to look exactly the same for every single person. Some of you are going to have your families live in your house when they get older. Some of you are going to live miles away from your parents. Some of you are going to have the job that you want. Some of you are going to have the job that somebody else wants you to have. If it was so direct, you could pick up the Mus'haf and flip to a page in the Quran and it would say, Khalid, here is the exact job you're supposed to have. That's just not how it works. It's purposely built to have you make decisions, but it's also purposely built to sometimes let decisions be different for different people in different situations. And it's not going to look exactly the same for every single person. Do you understand? And you cannot give advice that influences people's choices based off of solely subjective anecdotal experience, because they're not you as much as you're not them. And there's other things that come into the picture sometimes. So this construct of, well, Islamically this, or Islam says this, it gets overutilized to a point because it doesn't always have an explicit answer for everything. And that's the point. The point is that you make your own choices, because there's got to be something that you're accountable for when you stand in front of Allah, right? How can you have a day where you're judged according to the choices you made if there wasn't room for you to make choices on things to begin with? And it's not the broader sense of why we're made, but this worldly existence, it's a big part of it, the decision-making process. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? You start to like go into like, well, what goes into it? And how do I get it to a place that the things that are sensible, like those are the things that I want to have inform my choices? Does this make sense? Okay, so before we move on in the text for a bit, let's just turn to the person next to us. What are you taking away from this part of the conversation so far? You spent a good chunk of time on it because it's important, right? What are you taking away? Let's talk about it for a couple of minutes, then we'll come back and discuss, and then we'll move on in the text. But go ahead.
Probably my contact with like Spotify. No, for one time.
Okay. I can't. Yeah. I guess. Yeah.
Almost too much.
Like it'll matter for the day, but it won't matter like over and over.
Yeah, like that's never happened. So I was like, it was very flexible, very calm.
Okay. What are some of the things we're taking away so far? What are we discussing? Maybe we could hear from a couple of people. What are we taking away so far from this part of the conversation? Anybody? Why is it quiet?
Basically, we were having a discussion about how we're gonna implement not being guided by ego into our daily lives and just having to balance the need for boundaries, harm reduction, living in this ethic, while we also advocate ourselves for ourselves, but also having to deal with like very triggering events and how it's really difficult to do that, and it requires a lot of self-reflection and emotional regulation that I don't always have. But yeah, that's it's brought up more questions.
What were other questions that brought up?
I'm gonna ask you
Huh? I didn't ask you to ask the question. I said just make a list of the questions that we can. What were like other questions that it brings up?
yeah, like how do we balance like trauma that we've experienced with living in this ethic and again wanting to advocate for ourselves and deal with this world that's not guided by ethics and dealing with individuals that are not guided by ethics and that might discriminate against us or are physically harmful or psychologically harmful. How do we balance that? What do we do? Is it just taking the high road, which I'm not a fan of, and or do we like speak out against it? Like, what is the right way? Um, and I don't know if there's really a right answer for that, but other than self-reflecting when it does come up and you know, it's intersecting.
That's the whole point of this conversation, right? It's going to be situational, and you can't learn your religion in a way where you go online and you mesh a soundbite into a life that says, well, so and so said this, so that means in every circumstance it's going to always be the same, right? Do you get what I mean? Like, I don't talk to my son and my daughter the way I talk to their grandmother. Ethics are situational. Do you understand? They're going to vary based off of different circumstances and different kind of, you know, realities that have to be understood. Recognizing it in a place where there's also complexities that pop up. There's nothing in our religion that says you have to become somebody's doormat. But at the same time, you don't want to turn into that which it was that you are kind of going against. Do you know? And this is like a tool of Shaitan. He gives continuity to the perpetuation of vice by taking it from one heart and putting it into another, and validates like behaviors that move beyond like boundaries by saying, well, it was done to me, so I can now do something to somebody else. Do you know? This is also why, like, I've been saying in different settings for I don't know how many years at this point, but it's not meant to be like a individualistic religion, do you know? And you need to have healthy community that understands everybody's probably got some kind of crap going on in their life, and there's a baseline ethic that comes in and doesn't like size people up or push them out because they don't fit neatly into a box of what you mean like a good religious person to look like or be like. Do you get what I'm saying? Right? Like, people have a lot of heaviness going on in their life, and we don't want to validate abhorrent behavior, but there's challenges that come into play that it's not going to just be like that. Framing is important. What is the right way to do something? It's not going to always just have like a solitary, clean answer that's applicable in every situation. And that can be tough, but it's that much tougher if you go through it all alone. And you don't have people you can turn to and lean on and help you kind of reflect and carry the things that you're carrying, which are hard enough. Like, being sad is really tough. Being sad by yourself is that much tougher. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? And the other challenge that comes up is there's going to be people who actually answer this and give you a specific answer. And it's going to become that much more confusing. What do you do in X, Y, or Z scenario? Well, this is what you do. And then, like, just look at this room, right? all of you like look so different from each other. Do you know what I mean? You're clearly coming from different places and different backgrounds. How could fundamentally you exert a strategy that is the same exact thing of every single person in this room when you're dealing with like your parents, when you're dealing with your significant others, when you're dealing with your employees? It wouldn't make any sense, right? And that's how people learn religion. Like I go online, I learn something, I read something, and then it's just supposed to just fit into every single one of our lives in that way. Unless you're reading something that says pray 5 times a day, yes, all of you are supposed to pray 5 times a day. Do you know? And there's even an ethic to that. Not just out of burdensome obligation, but applying a value-driven mindset to the idea as to why, like, it's ethical for me to do what God asks me to do. Given everything that God gives to me, is it really that much of an ask to do like a few minimal things? And the benefit of the spiritual exercise comes back to me to begin with. So the ethic isn't just about my submission to the divine, but a self-care that I become negligent of because it's supposed to be a replenishment and an oasis for my internal, not a distraction that keeps me from acquiring more of the dunya or the validation of people who only accept me when I become that which I'm not to begin with. Do you see? The minute that you can embrace the idea that it's not going to look the same for everybody and that the exertion of ethics are going to depend on circumstances, that this isn't the religion that makes everything black and white. And if that's hard to deal with, like it's a part of like you're going to have to embrace it at some level, do you know? And then make tough decisions in relation to it. And the last part I'll say to it, there's certain things that are unequivocally always wrong. Abuse, always wrong. If you try to justify abusing somebody or your friend abusing somebody, you should fear God. A man is abusing a child, he hears a voice behind him. Allah has more dominion over you than you do over this child. He turns and he sees it's the messenger of God. Anger is apparent on his face. Well, messenger of God, he's free from this. And the prophet, who doesn't get angry a lot, with anger apparent on his face, good, had you not done so, you would have burned in the fire like a flaming coal. No words minced. Understand? And the consequences of it, abuse, oppression, inequity, and everything that leads to it. Racisms, the ugliest forms of arrogance that is racism. Like you can seek to validate it, but then everybody who's hurting, consequently exerting decisions from the hurt you place in their heart, you have responsibility for that hurt that they carry. So just because you got away with mistreating someone, like doesn't mean that it just stops and ends there. You understand? And for the person who's recipient of it, what our tradition teaches us is you just try your best. That's all it is that our God is asking of us. But you got to be in a place where it's also still individualized. And that vulnerability and honesty doesn't have to be determined alone. And it can be hard, but we have that much more of an imperative, is what I believe in general. Like we have a large community, it's about 10, 15,000 people. Do you know? There's going to be idiots when you have that many people. Do you know what I mean? Don't be one of the idiots. It's really tough when somebody comes and sits with me and says, I came here a few years ago. The first person I met was somebody who X, Y, or Z to me. I'll say, I'm sorry. Like I can't invalidate experiences. This is why you make choices. And if you're making them in the absence of ethics, you're still making them. And then that person carries that pain for years, has a challenge going into places of prayer, has a challenge in even putting their head down on a prayer mat, all because I made a decision through ego and not through ethics. How can you not understand that every moment that they exert through the pain you put in their heart, you potentially have accountability in front of God as a result of that. And this is why all of these dimensions have overlap. The ethics are not informed by a moral relativism, but by a theology that is rooted primarily in a belief in Allah, a belief in the last day and a day of judgment, and that these are things, whether I believe in them or not, they don't need me to believe it for it to be true. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? And so, yeah, it can be tough. It can be hard. You just got to try your best. But you also got to make sure that you're owning up to what your best is and not letting it be something that just carries forth. And then you're creating that accountability back to yourself. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Okay, let's do this. We're going to move forward on the text. I thought that was something that we should have just gone back to. Sit with it a bit and let yourself kind of think about it. Just think about it. Do you know what I mean? And then in a couple of days, think back to the conversation. What kind of comes up? You don't have to name things right in the moment. And then see where it can kind of inform in a way that's productive. It's not meant to create like limits, paralysis. It's meant to be empowering, right? I want to interject like courage into my decision making. This is why we have like a prophet of God who we're taught is the most balanced of individuals. Do you know? So the Prophet alayhi salam, his courage is the middle way. This is why we know courage is like the balanced ethic, because it is the middle ground, because he is a balanced individual, and it becomes now the balancing ethic between cowardliness and recklessness. Do you see? Does that make sense? Right? Generosity is the balancing ethic between like greed and extravagance. You see? And so you read the Seerah, you read the Shama'il, like the descriptions of the Prophet, you read like these things with a sense of, oh, like these are character traits that I want to embody and not just like speak about. I want to live them as best as I can. And if I screw up, I'm not trying to hate on myself, but I just, get up and try again. Do you see? Okay. We didn't read any more of the text. Are people tired? Should we just stop here right now? Yeah, you're tired? Yeah, I appreciate your honesty. Huh? That's okay, man. I'm still at work. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you can ask a question. It's not a problem to ask questions. I'm sorry that I did what I did the last time, but you can ask whatever you want. Go ahead. Yeah, yeah. You weren't even here last time. It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things we were discussing is that sometimes it's unclear to oneself when, especially if like somebody transgressed a boundary somehow or harmed you in some way, to distinguish between like acting out of your values and taking care of yourself and like acting out of your nest and actually making it worse. So I don't know, I guess two different questions, maybe there's one time for one. Like one of them would be like any advice on how to like figure that out in those kinds of moments, or like alternatively, like let's just say probably most of the time it's the next, but in the moment it's just really hard not to believe, the ego telling you like you need to respond in that way so that you protect yourself, so that that person understands. Like I don't know, so just any advice on
Yeah,
that?
but it depends, right? Like resentment, just like every other emotion, is given to us by Allah. Resentment is the emotion that tells us, like, hey, you're not treating me well. I resent you for your treatment. It can become toxic if you only feel empowered through feeling resentment, right? Like I work with a lot of survivors of abuse. May Allah make it easy for them. Like they cannot rely on resentment as the tool through which they are able to stand upright every day of their life. Do you know? It's a necessary tool to be able to say, you're not doing right by me, but it's got to have like a stop time to it. Do you know? In a particular circumstance, you're not going to also have a reasonable expectation that with immediacy, like there's going to be a response that is going to also have to carry over for like weeks and months thereafter, right? You can take a pause. And this is why hastiness is not a good thing. But how you might respond in the initial moments is different than how you would respond hours later versus days later versus weeks later. And what's getting riled up in a moment is reasonable to get riled up. But to get to a place where balance is restored through recovery modes, that you just get to know yourself a little bit better. Do you know? Do you understand what I'm saying? So understanding, like, if in this state that I'm in, I don't have the capacity to know what part of me is making a decision, then why is that the best time to make a decision? Right? If it comes down to matters of safety, your safety is always the most important thing, no matter what. You get out of a situation that's unsafe as best as you can. You don't pretend like you know how to help someone if you don't, because it's not as simple as we'll just leave your house and come to our house, right? Because people who mistreat, they will still seek to control. So there's got to be like exit plans and strategy plans. That's why we started a domestic violence agency. That's why we have a shelter. That's why we have professionals who do these types of things. We're not going to fault the person who's immersed in a life of difficulty, that their responses in that moment are becoming instinctive in relation to an unnatural mode of existence. It's haram in Sharia to make something live in a way that's unnatural to the way it's supposed to live, right? So like, Kentucky Fried Chicken for a while was only called KFC because they injected so many hormones and so many steroids into the animals so that it would enlarge particular pieces of the animal. It couldn't even be called chicken anymore legally because of how much they transformed it. You cannot do that to another animal. It is unnatural in its way of existence. Do you see what I'm saying? The same thing applies to humans. It is not natural for somebody to live in a prison, albeit an emotional prison, that is bombarded with abuse and oppression and trauma. Nor is it like easy to live in systems and structures that are purposely built to make you hate yourself. But as best as you can, then you frequent spaces more that are uplifting and healing, and you lean on people that still, where you have matters of decision making, you make those decisions. Do you see? But my reaction in the immediate isn't going to always be indicative of what my reaction will be after I've had some time to kind of recenter. Do you understand? And as I get to know myself through myself, I can gauge, like, well, how do I respond? And when am I at a place where I'm poised to actually have reflection in this mode of kind of presence that doesn't have me do something that I regret, nor am I making an excuse for my behavior that somehow I justify knowing that it's still hurting somebody when that doesn't have to be the case. Do you see? And there's a difference between me defending myself versus me like saying I'm doing it for this, but in reality, that's not what it actually is. Do you get what I mean? And again, it can be tricky, right? And that's why you want to have people you talk to, which is not a computer screen or a YouTube video or like a kind of segment of a talk that's been reduced down to 30 seconds or a minute. You have like another human that's sitting with you, that's creating an opportunity for you to self-express, let out some of what you're holding in your heart, and then just empathetically, they're carrying some of it, and you can begin to think about some of the things that you're thinking about, right? Because it's a very real reality that is cliche but has substance, that hurt people. And you're still potentially going to hurt someone at the end of the day through your hurt. And you want to find the healing that's necessary so it's not perpetuating the same cycle, that Shaitan wants to advance the vice and create now some sense of justification and validity to it. Do you know what I mean? If God forbid my father beat me as a child and I have trauma inside of me, it doesn't validate me beating my own child. Correct? And I got to do some heart work, but it's that much harder if the community around me doesn't create systems and spaces and mechanisms for that heart work to actually happen, or they only engage in a discourse or rhetoric that is about the do's and don'ts and the rights and wrongs framed in halal and haram, and then doesn't bring in the other parts of the religion that can be healing and empowering, like the theology, like the spiritual tradition, like the ethical systems. Do you see what I mean? And then practice becomes difficult because I got pain. It's like I'm praying so much. How come the pain's not going away? I stayed up in the middle of the night and prayed tahajjud for 2 hours. I read so much Quran. It's still like the form of something, and it needs to have an inner component to it. And who's helping to cultivate an understanding, not of the existence of it as an idea, but the understanding of how you cultivate it and nourish it. The ego will be stronger if you strengthen it more, and the heart will be stronger